Ethan Carter had inherited more than just acres of tilled earth when he took over his family's farm. He inherited a legacy of sweat, hope, and a deep-rooted connection to the land that had nourished generations. Nestled amid gently rolling hills on the outskirts of a once sleepy town, Carter's farm was a living tapestry of tradition and progress. Expansive fields of golden wheat and vibrant organic vegetables stretched to the horizon, while a weathered red barn stood as a proud testament to decades of labor and love. For Ethan, every furrow in the soil held memories of his childhood, and every sunrise over the pasture promised another day of honest work. A rugged yet soft-spoken man, Ethan was as much a champion of modern, sustainable farming as he was a guardian of the old ways. When he wasn't tending to his crops or repairing the aging tractor, he could be found advising local growers on eco-friendly practices and organizing community-supported agriculture events. His life was one of balance, a fusion of time-honored techniques and innovative methods that kept his farm thriving against the odds of modern industrial farming. Yet despite this harmony with nature, an unwelcome disturbance was brewing on the horizon, one that would soon shatter Ethan's peaceful rhythm. In the small community that had long prized its unspoken independence, a new power had emerged. At the helm of the local homeowners association (HOA) was Karen, a self-appointed arbiter of taste and order. Known for her relentless pursuit of perfection and her uncanny ability to nitpick every detail, Karen had long harbored a disdain for anyone who dared deviate from her meticulously crafted vision of community standards. Although her jurisdiction traditionally covered manicured lawns and suburban streets, Karen now saw Ethan's sprawling, hard-working farm as a blemish on her carefully curated picture of order. One crisp autumn morning, as golden light bathed the dewy fields, Ethan set out on his daily rounds. Dressed in faded denim overalls and sturdy work boots, he walked the perimeter of his property, mentally checking off his to-do list. Near the farmhouse, where wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze, a small crowd had gathered. At the center of this impromptu assembly stood Karen, clad in a pastel blazer, a crisply ironed skirt, and oversized sunglasses that gave her an air of untouchable authority. With a clipboard in hand and a practiced look of superiority, she surveyed the land as though it were a canvas awaiting her corrections. "Mr. Carter," Karen announced in a tone that blended saccharine politeness with thinly veiled disdain, "it has come to our attention that the exterior lighting on your property fails to meet our community's aesthetic standards. The brightness of your fixtures is not only disruptive, it's downright unsightly." Ethan paused, wiping his brow. He had installed those lights for very practical reasons: to safely navigate his property after dusk and to secure the barn against nocturnal prowlers. "Karen," he replied evenly, "these lights are strictly for safety and functional use. I haven't signed on to any agreement that limits my ability to run a working farm. My property has always been maintained to a high standard, and these lights serve a vital purpose." Unmoved, Karen produced a crisp, official-looking notice from her clipboard. "This is your final warning, Mr. Carter. You are required to bring your property into compliance by the end of the week, or face further action." Her voice was firm, each syllable dripping with condescension, as if she were bestowing a reluctant favor rather than enforcing an arbitrary rule. The assembled neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Many had silently questioned the intrusion of HOA rules into every facet of life, especially when it came to a working farm. For Ethan, the encounter stung deeply. It wasn't merely a challenge to his operational methods. It was an affront to his very identity. His farm wasn't a decorative lawn to be regulated. It was a living, breathing entity that required flexibility and practicality over rigid aesthetics. As the onlookers dispersed, murmurs of support and discontent rippled through the crowd. Some residents, long emboldened by Karen's overreach, nodded sympathetically at Ethan. Others, intimidated by her well-rehearsed authority, hurried away. Ethan was left alone with the final warning in hand, a document that bore a seal he'd never seen before and a signature that promised no compromise. With a heavy heart but a stubborn glint in his eye, he realized this was only the first salvo in what would become a long and bitter struggle. That very day, As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the tilled fields, Ethan made a silent vow. He would stand by his heritage and his right to run his farm as he saw fit, even if it meant confronting a bureaucratic giant who had no business meddling in the affairs of hard-working farmers. The peaceful hum of nature was now punctuated by the sound of a brewing battle. A battle that pitted one man's legacy against an entire system built on entitlement and misplaced authority. The following morning, Ethan awoke to a quiet that felt strangely unsettled. Over his steaming cup of coffee, he pored over the final warning Karen had delivered the previous day. The official tone and heavy language of the notice left little room for negotiation, and yet, as a man well-versed in local ordinances and rights, he knew something was off. That same day, as he made his way to the barn, a bright yellow envelope, sealed with the HOA crest, was pinned to the side of the weathered structure. With a sinking feeling, Ethan tore it open to reveal a fine of $750 for violating exterior lighting regulations, along with a series of warnings and legal threats couched in bureaucratic jargon. He ran his calloused fingers over the printed words. "This is preposterous," he muttered. The fine was excessive, and its justification even more so. For a working farm, safety and functionality had always trumped any aesthetic considerations. Yet here was Karen, armed with rules that seemed to have no basis in the community's founding principles. No sooner had he absorbed the shock than the sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence. Ethan stepped outside and found Karen, standing on the front porch with her arms crossed and a smug smile tugging at her lips. The early morning sun caught the gleam of determination in her eyes as she said, "I told you, Mr. Carter, the rules apply to everyone, regardless of your personal beliefs or needs." Ethan's response was measured and deliberate. "Karen, I understand the importance of community standards. However, these lights are vital for my safety and the security of the farm. I'm well within my rights under local law." His voice, firm yet respectful, carried across the quiet street. Karen's smile faltered for only a moment before she resumed her condescending tone. "Local laws are clear. Every property in this community must adhere to the standards set forth by the HOA. You may think you're an exception because of your background, but rules are rules." Her words were backed by the threat of escalating penalties, a threat that Ethan knew all too well from stories shared by other long-suffering residents. Later that day, as inspectors arrived unexpectedly at the farm, Ethan's determination hardened. A pair of officials, clipboards in hand, began a cursory inspection of his property. Karen hovered nearby, relishing every moment of his discomfort. "Everything will be fine once you comply," she insisted, her tone dripping with assurance, as if she were the final authority on all matters of community aesthetics. Ethan, however, had done his homework. He cited local zoning codes and agricultural exemptions that clearly allowed for practical modifications on working farms. "I'm not violating any law," he told the inspectors. "My lighting is strictly functional. I haven't signed on to an HOA contract that would restrict a family farm from maintaining its necessary operations." Despite his calm explanation, Karen's presence loomed large, her disapproval seemingly enough to rattle the officials. As the inspectors left with polite nods, but with Karen's pointed glances lingering in the air, Ethan realized that Karen was using every trick in the book. The fine, the surprise inspection, and the threatening language, all were part of a calculated power moved to force him into submission. The sense of injustice burned within him, fueling a resolve that would soon drive him to stand up not just for himself, but for every property owner subjected to arbitrary rules. After the inspectors departed, Ethan retreated to the farmhouse, his mind racing with strategies. The legal jargon and the excessive fine weren't just mistakes, they were deliberate actions meant to intimidate. His gaze fell upon a family photo on the mantel, and he remembered the countless hours spent turning barren land into a productive farm. The thought of abandoning that legacy was unbearable. In a hushed conversation later that evening with a trusted neighbor, another local farmer who had also suffered under Karen's ruthless enforcement, Ethan voiced his determination to fight back. "They think they can bully me with fines and inspections," he declared. But I have the law on my side and the support of people who know what this land really means. His neighbor's nod of agreement affirmed that this wasn't just his battle. It was a communal stand against an overreaching authority. Karen's first power move had been a blatant attempt to subdue a man who simply wanted to keep his farm running. The fine, issued without proper warning or legal basis, was a message: comply or suffer. And though Ethan felt the sting of that threat, it only steeled his resolve further. As twilight fell over the sprawling fields, the battle lines were drawn. The quiet determination in Ethan's eyes promised that the fight for his legacy was only beginning. In the days that followed, the calm of Carter's farm was shattered by a new series of challenges. Karen wasn't satisfied with a single fine and a few stern words. She was determined to make an example out of Ethan. Rumors began circulating among the community. Whispers of false violations, threats of eviction, and even talk of property seizure. It wasn't long before Karen's tactics escalated from bureaucratic intimidation to outright bullying. One overcast afternoon, as Ethan inspected his fields after a torrential rain, a stern knock echoed from the barn door. When he opened it, he was confronted by a formal-looking envelope accompanied by a terse note. Due to persistent noncompliance, a new notice of violation has been issued. All necessary actions must be taken immediately to avoid further legal consequences. The notice cited obscure infractions, improper fence heights, unauthorized signage, even excessive tractor noise. Each violation was baseless on its face, yet Karen's signature was stamped on every document. Ethan's heart pounded as he read the list. His farm was a working operation, not a manicured suburban estate. Determined to uncover the truth behind these charges, he began poring over local ordinances and HOA documentation late into the night. With the aid of a friend in the county planning office, he discovered that many of the fines appeared to be selectively enforced. Even more alarming was the revelation that several board members had quietly questioned Karen's decisions in recent months, but had been silenced by her domineering personality. One evening, while attending a small-town council meeting, Ethan caught a whispered conversation between a longtime board member and a concerned neighbor. Karen's been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, the board member confided in a hushed tone. And every time she issues a violation against a property owner, there's some hidden agenda behind it. That revelation ignited a spark in Ethan. Not only was he facing an unjust war against arbitrary rules, but it now appeared that Karen was engaged in a web of corruption that extended far beyond his farm. Armed with newfound resolve, Ethan started documenting every encounter, every notice, and every dubious claim that Karen and her cohorts levied against him. He installed discreet cameras around the perimeter of the property and kept meticulous records of all communications. His investigation wasn't merely an act of self-defense. It was the beginning of a counterattack aimed at exposing an entrenched system of abuse. Matters reached a boiling point when one chilly morning, Karen stormed onto the farm with a cadre of stern-looking HOA enforcers. "You've ignored every warning, Mr. Carter," she shouted, her voice echoing off the barn walls. "Today, we begin the process of reclaiming what's rightfully ours." She waved a new document, a notice of potential property seizure due to repeated violations. The threat was real, and it struck at the very heart of everything Ethan had worked for. Despite the intimidation, Ethan remained calm. "I have every right to operate my farm as I see fit," he retorted. "Your rules do not apply here, and these violations are a sham." His words were not just defiant. They were a rallying cry to all those who had quietly suffered under Karen's iron grip. In that heated moment, a few onlooking farmers exchanged determined glances. They too had been fed up with the arbitrary punishments and the corruption lurking behind the HOA's pristine facade. Karen's response was to double down. Over the next few weeks, she ramped up the pressure by sending multiple official letters demanding compliance, with an ever-growing list of absurd infractions. With every new notice, the burden on Ethan became heavier. Yet, as he organized community meetings and reached out to other affected property owners, it became clear that he was not alone. More and more farmers began to share stories of baseless fines and underhanded tactics, and whispers of rebellion grew louder. Late one night, as rain drummed on the farmhouse roof, Ethan sat in front of his computer, reviewing the evidence he had painstakingly collected. The documents, camera footage, and testimonials painted a damning picture of a crooked system exploited by a power-hungry few. His determination crystallized. If Karen was prepared to bend the law to serve her own interests, then it was time to expose her for what she truly was, a tyrant masquerading as a guardian of community standards. By dawn, Ethan had drafted a detailed report outlining every discrepancy and illegal action perpetrated by the HOA under Karen's leadership. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a call to arms for every homeowner and farmer who had been unjustly victimized. With the first rays of sunlight filtering through the clouds, Ethan felt the weight of the coming battle. The war was no longer just about one fine or one violation. It was about fighting for justice, reclaiming autonomy, and restoring honor to a community that had long been held hostage by arbitrary rules and unchecked corruption. As the weeks turned into a blur of constant battles, Karen's tactics grew bolder and more destructive. One chilly morning, Ethan awoke to find his driveway partially dug up. Heavy machinery, emblazoned with the HOA logo, was in the midst of repositioning his prized tractor. Karen's explanation was as absurd as it was infuriating. The HOA was expanding sidewalks to improve the neighborhood's image. To Ethan, it was nothing short of vandalism. Furious, yet composed, he rushed outside, determined to confront the latest infringement head-on. As he approached the scene, Karen was already on site, clipboard in hand and eyes alight with the satisfaction of a job half done. "Mr. Carter," she said coolly, "if you had maintained your property in line with community standards, you wouldn't have had to endure this inconvenience." Her voice was icy, void of any genuine concern for the damage being done. Ethan's response was measured, his voice carrying a quiet authority born of countless hours of honest labor. "I'm running a working farm, Karen. My priority isn't to create a picture-perfect facade. It's to ensure the livelihood of my family and the community that depends on us. What you're doing is not improvement, it's destruction." His words rang out across the field, and for a moment, even the workers paused, their shovels falling silent. By the time word of the incident spread, the community was abuzz. Neighbors and fellow farmers, long accustomed to Karen's overreach, began to rally behind Ethan. At the next HOA meeting, an event that had traditionally been a tedious display of Karen's authoritarian rule, Ethan strode in with a thick folder of legal documents and irrefutable evidence of corruption. The meeting room, usually dominated by Karen's dismissive smirks and smug declarations, fell into an uneasy hush. Ethan set the folder on the long conference table and addressed the room with quiet conviction. "I have spent the past several weeks gathering evidence that shows not only that these so-called violations are baseless, but also that funds have been misused and that our community is being governed by arbitrary rules." His voice, though calm, carried the weight of truth. "I am not asking for special treatment. I am asking for fairness and accountability." For the first time, a few HOA board members exchanged uncertain glances. One even murmured, "This isn't right." The dissent, though subtle at first, began to grow. Several community members took turns sharing their own stories of harassment and inexplicable fines. With each testimonial, Karen's veneer of authority cracked just a little more. Faced with mounting evidence and a vocal community rallying for justice, Karen's demeanor shifted from smug assurance to a desperate insistence on control. "You all are overreacting," she snapped, attempting to regain authority. "These rules are in place to protect the community's image and property values. If Mr. Carter cannot abide by them, then perhaps he should reconsider his position in this neighborhood." But Ethan wasn't finished. "I have every right to operate my farm as I see fit, and I will not be bullied into compliance with rules that serve no purpose other than to enrich a select few at the expense of hardworking families." His declaration was met with a murmur of approval from those present, and even a couple of board members nodded in agreement. The tide had begun to turn. Emboldened by the support and the mounting evidence of misconduct, Ethan announced plans for a community forum where all affected residents could air their grievances and demand accountability from the HOA. Flyers were printed, social media groups were formed, and soon the entire community was abuzz with plans for change. Karen's threat of legal action and property seizure now seemed like a last-ditch effort to salvage a crumbling power structure. In the midst of chaos, Ethan couldn't help but feel a bittersweet satisfaction. The very rules designed to control him were now uniting his neighbors against an unjust system. As the community prepared for a public showdown with the HOA, Ethan's resolve solidified. He would fight not just for his farm, but for the dignity and rights of every person who had ever been bullied by arbitrary authority. That day, as the sun dipped behind the fields and the farm was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Ethan looked over his land, a patchwork of hard-won victories and enduring traditions, and knew that this battle was far from over. But with the community behind him and the truth on his side, he was ready to strike back, determined to expose the corruption and reclaim the freedom to run his farm as his ancestors had intended. Desperation often brings out a person's darkest tactics, and Karen was no exception. With the community rallying behind Ethan and mounting evidence of corruption in her wake, she resolved on one final, extreme maneuver. Late one humid afternoon, as Ethan was busy repairing a section of the aging barn, his phone buzzed urgently. A message from an unknown number warned him that a police unit was en route to his property. An emergency call had been placed citing a public disturbance caused by his excessive lighting and disruptive farm operations. Within minutes, the sound of sirens shattered the calm of the late afternoon. Blue and red lights danced across the fields as two police cruisers pulled up at the entrance. Ethan's heart sank as he hurried to greet the officers, knowing that Karen had orchestrated this ploy to further isolate him from his community. Before he could protest, a stern-faced officer stepped forward. "Sir, we received a call about a disturbance on your property," the officer announced, his tone brisk and unyielding. Ethan's mind raced. "I assure you, officer, everything here is in order. My lights are for safety, and my machinery is operating as needed for a functioning farm." At that moment, Karen emerged from the crowd that had gathered near the fence, her expression a blend of triumph and panic. "Look, these lights are a menace," she insisted loudly, "and your equipment is causing a disturbance for the neighborhood." Her voice, amplified by the tension of the moment, echoed across the field. The officer, accustomed to such disputes, eyed Ethan and then Karen with measured skepticism. "I'm going to need some identification and an explanation," he said. In a calm but assertive tone, Ethan produced his farmer's license and identification, along with copies of local zoning laws and HOA exemption clauses for agricultural properties. "I believe you'll find that I'm in full compliance with the law," he explained. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Karen, Ethan's diligent documentation had captured every moment of this confrontation. Hidden cameras placed strategically around the property recorded the entire exchange, from Karen's inflammatory remarks to the officers mounting doubts about the complaint. When one of the patrol officers discreetly reviewed the footage on a tablet, his raised eyebrow spoke volumes. As the situation grew more heated, Karen's desperation became apparent. In a moment of reckless audacity, she attempted to orchestrate another twist. She had secretly hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Ethan, and evidence soon surfaced that the PI had been caught on camera trespassing on the farm premises. Ethan's collected footage captured the trespasser in the act, and even more damning was a glimpse of Karen herself, furtively meeting with a PI near the barn. The incriminating evidence was irrefutable. Karen was not only misusing her authority, but was also engaging in illegal surveillance and orchestrated harassment. At the next scheduled HOA meeting, with the community in attendance and the tension palpable, Ethan took center stage. With a deep breath, he connected his laptop to a large screen and played the footage for everyone to see. The grainy video showed Karen's aggressive stance on the farm, her call to the police, and the private investigator's unauthorized entry onto his property. Murmurs of shock and outrage rippled through the crowd. Even board members, who had once supported Karen, now exchanged glances of disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan said firmly, "this is not just about my farm. This is about every one of us who has ever been bullied by arbitrary rules and corrupt leadership. Karen's actions have not only violated our rights, they've broken the trust that should bind our community together." The room erupted in a cacophony of indignation and support. Some residents wept at the injustice, while others shouted for accountability. The evidence was undeniable, and Karen's final desperate move had backfired spectacularly. The police officer, still present from the earlier incident, corroborated Ethan's account, admitting that the complaint seemed orchestrated rather than rooted in any genuine concern. Cornered and exposed, Karen's once impenetrable facade crumbled. Her final gambit, a desperate call for law enforcement intervention, only served to cement her reputation as a bully who had overstepped every boundary of decency and legality. As the community's anger mounted, Karen's protestations dissolved into incoherent excuses. In that fateful meeting, the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Ethan's calm and resolute demeanor, backed by incontrovertible evidence, had turned the tide. With the truth now laid bare, the community's trust in Karen and the HOA was shattered. The room was charged with a newfound energy, a determination to restore fairness, and to ensure that no one would be subjected to such arbitrary tyranny again. In the wake of the explosive HOA meeting, the entire community underwent a seismic shift. What had once been a quiet neighborhood, haunted by Karen's overreach, began to transform into a collective force for justice. In the days that followed, a series of extraordinary events unfolded, marking the beginning of the end for Karen's despotic reign. The community organized an emergency town hall meeting in the local community center, a modest space that quickly filled with residents determined to reclaim their rights. Farmers, families, and longtime homeowners all gathered, united by the shared outrage against the HOA's corrupt practices. At the heart of the meeting, Ethan Carter took the podium once again. His presence was commanding yet humble, a testament to the strength of a man who had fought for his home and his livelihood. "Today," Ethan declared, "we stand together against a system that has exploited our trust and imposed rules that have no place in our community." His words resonated deeply. The meeting erupted in applause, and for the first time in many years, the voices of the people drowned out the whispers of entitlement that had long dictated the neighborhood's fate. Faced with mounting evidence and an emboldened community, the HOA's governing board was forced to take action. A motion was put forward to conduct an independent audit of the HOA's finances and procedures. The results were damning: misappropriated funds, unauthorized fines, and a pattern of decisions made unilaterally by Karen. The audit report became the catalyst for a swift and decisive vote of no confidence. With overwhelming support, Karen was officially removed from her position as HOA president. The vote was not only a rejection of her leadership, it was a symbolic victory for every homeowner who had suffered under her rule. As the news of Karen's ousting spread, the consequences began to multiply. The city launched its own investigation into the HOA's practices, and legal actions were quickly initiated. Neighbors who had once been silenced now felt empowered to speak out, and class action lawsuits were filed against the HOA for its abuse of power. The very organization that had once stood as a pillar of community order was now crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. Karen's personal life, too, began to unravel. In the midst of public humiliation, she was forced to step down not only from the HOA, but also from her role as a respected community member. Rumors spread that her own home was being scrutinized for violations, ironic, given her previous zeal in enforcing rules on others. The once imposing figure now found herself besieged by legal notices and mounting fines. Friends and associates distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the fallout from her misdeeds. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. He had never set out to dismantle an institution. He only wanted to defend his right to run his farm without arbitrary interference. Yet, as the community celebrated the collapse of the corrupt HOA, he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of justice. Sitting on his now peaceful, well-lit porch, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The bright, functional lights that had once been the subject of Karen's initial attack now shone as a symbol of resilience and integrity. The transformation was complete. Karen's downfall had not only liberated Ethan from endless harassment, it had also ignited a broader movement toward transparency and fairness. The community began rebuilding trust and fostering an environment where every voice was heard. The legacy of Carter's Farm, once under siege by unjust authority, now stood as a beacon of hope for what could be achieved when a community united in the pursuit of truth. In the aftermath, as Karen's influence evaporated and the HOA's mismanagement was laid bare for all to see, Ethan found himself at the center of a grassroots revolution. His steadfast refusal to be bullied had sparked a movement that promised to restore the dignity of every homeowner and farmer in the region. And so, as he sipped his morning coffee on that very porch that had witnessed so much turmoil, Ethan allowed himself a small, triumphant smile, a smile that said, "Justice has finally come home." In the wake of Karen's dramatic ouster, the fallout extended far beyond individual grievances. The HOA, now under intense public scrutiny, faced a barrage of legal challenges. An independent investigation revealed that the association's practices were not only arbitrary, but also in clear violation of state property and consumer protection laws. With damning evidence in hand, local authorities slapped the HOA with hefty fines, and legal action was swiftly initiated against several board members complicit in the corruption. Ethan, now regarded as a community hero, led efforts to organize a class action lawsuit on behalf of every resident who had been wronged. The lawsuit, meticulously prepared with documents, witness testimonies, and the audit report, was a bold move to reclaim lost rights and ensure accountability. "This isn't just about one person or one fine," Ethan declared at a press conference. "It's about restoring fairness to our community and sending a message that abuse of power will not be tolerated." The legal battle was fierce, but ultimately transformative. As court dates were set and media attention increased, the HOA was forced to confront its systemic issues. Several board members faced legal consequences, ranging from fines to mandates for restitution, while the association itself was dissolved and reformed under a new, transparent governance structure. For many in the community, this marked the end of an era defined by arbitrary decisions and unchecked authority. Ethan's final power move, organizing and championing the lawsuit, cemented his legacy as a defender of community rights. His commitment to justice resonated with residents, and his story quickly became a rallying cry for reform. The legal proceedings not only held the corrupt accountable, but also paved the way for a more inclusive and democratic process in the management of community affairs. As the legal hammer fell on the HOA, Karen's personal life began to crumble in tandem with her public persona. Stripped of her authority and facing a series of legal actions, she was forced to confront the harsh reality of her own misconduct. Once celebrated as the strict enforcer of community standards, Karen now found herself isolated and humiliated. The very people she had once intimidated now regarded her as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that entitlement and abuse of power come at a steep price. The news of her misdeeds spread like wildfire, and public opinion turned swiftly. Rumors of financial mismanagement, secret meetings to coerce neighbors, and even personal indiscretions began to surface. In a cruel twist of fate, the same regulations she had zealously enforced were now being applied to her own property. Notices of violation were posted on her front door, fines accumulated, and even her closest allies distanced themselves from her tarnished reputation. One bitter morning, as Karen packed a few belongings from the once grand home that had symbolized her power, she was seen by neighbors being escorted from the property by local officials. The sight was a potent symbol of poetic justice, one that left no doubt that her reign had ended in disgrace. Her fall from grace was not marked by dramatic fanfare, but by a quiet, painful unraveling of everything she had built. For Ethan, the culmination of Karen's downfall was a bittersweet victory. Though he felt no personal pleasure in watching someone suffer, The justice that had been served reaffirmed his belief in fairness and community solidarity. He observed from afar as Karen, now a shadow of her former self, struggled to salvage what little remained of her dignity. The once proud enforcer of rules was now reduced to a cautionary figure, a living reminder that tyranny, no matter how cleverly disguised, always finds its reckoning. Months later, life in the community had taken on a new, hopeful rhythm. Carter's farm thrived as always, its fields now bathed in the warm glow of well-intentioned lights, rather than punitive ones. The neighborhood, once held hostage by arbitrary rules and bullying tactics, had embraced a spirit of openness, transparency, and cooperation. Ethan often spent his evenings on the farmhouse porch, a cup of coffee in hand and a quiet smile playing on his lips as he watched the sun dip below the horizon. Neighbors would pass by, sharing friendly greetings and recounting small victories that symbolized the community's hard-won freedom. The scars left by Karen's reign had faded, replaced by an enduring sense of solidarity and resilience. One evening, during a casual gathering on the newly revitalized Main Street, a jovial resident, ever the practical joker, handed Ethan a mock violation notice for having excessively good taste in farming. Laughter rippled through the crowd as Ethan held up the paper, shaking his head in amused disbelief. "They really tried, didn't they?" he said with a wry grin. His remark was met with hearty chuckles and warm applause, a final mic drop moment that summed up the transformation of a community once held captive by fear. In that light-hearted exchange, the absurdity of the past was laid to rest. The neighborhood had not only survived a period of tyranny, but had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. For Ethan, the journey had been as much about reclaiming his own dignity as it had been about forging a path for others to follow. His farm and the community around it had become a living testament to the power of standing up for one's rights, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. As the night grew deeper and stars began to twinkle above the quiet fields, Ethan leaned back in his chair and reflected on the turbulent months that had passed. What began as a solitary struggle against an overzealous enforcer had blossomed into a movement for justice and change. In that serene moment, he silently acknowledged that the battle had been hard-fought, but the victory was all the sweeter for it. And so, as the community carried on into a new era marked by fairness and transparency, Ethan Carter's story became legend, a reminder that when one person stands up to injustice, it can spark a revolution that transforms an entire community. With a final sip of his coffee and a contented smile, he knew the legacy of Carter's farm would continue to flourish long after the echoes of tyranny had faded into memory.